Welcome to welcome to life online. So this is Father's Day. This is Father's Day, and it's important to remember that spirit of divine power and presence is always washing over us, is always right there, even if we think we're out in the desert by ourselves. That divine masculine present is still guarding and guiding us, no matter what it looks like. So I'm going to say the same thing I say at the beginning of every Father's Day talk and every Mother's Day talk. Even if, first of all, happy Father's Day. For those of you who have acted as the male mental equivalent of love and safety to any child or any being, I give thanks and praise for spirit as you, right here and right now. And for those who have more challenging relationships with a father figure, whether they are the father figure or not, maybe they didn't have a dad, maybe their dad was not particularly skilled at showing healthy love. What is ours to do is to reparent ourselves and to remember that there is no human being that can act as our parents that is ever going to match our internal expectations, because our internal expectations are based on our experience of the divine mother and father. Somewhere back in our subconscious, there is this idea, this spiritual prototype of parent that may or may not match what happens here on earth. And so I just invite you now to experience the divine masculine. And if you're divine masculine, if you're looking at what could be your idea of masculinity and you're thinking, that's not divine, I'm going to invite you to take ownership of that, to choose to redefine what it means to be masculine. Now, each of us have the masculine and feminine within us, and on Father's Day, we take a deep dive into what it means to be that active principle of the divine. Now, you might notice that I have kind of switched around. This week, I'm talking about mindful action rather than mindful speech. Because with the divine masculine in me, I noticed that it didn't fit the way I wanted it to, and so I made the choice to switch the titles. You know, that's the kind of power we actually do have. If you don't like the chapter you're on, rename it and rewrite it. There is always that choice for us. Now, for most people, or at least in this culture, in this Judeo-Christian culture, we think of God as Father, or we have thought. And I often hear prayers about, to that particular God, talking about guarding and guiding. And so that's kind of the theme of my talk today. Can we mindfully look at how the divine masculine is there for us, how we're asking the divine masculine to show up, and how are we being the divine masculine and guarding and guiding those in our care, including ourselves. So the first one is guard. Often in the past, we've thought of God's on our side, and God is who is on our banner as we go into war, or God is the one as guard that keeps us from harm because there's something out there that wants to harm us. I'm going to ask you to think of that perhaps as one way of being masculine, and one way that perhaps it would be in our best interest to outgrow, so that we don't have to go to war anymore, so we don't have to pretend that there is a power secondary to God that is out there that wants to harm us. The only thing out there is more God, more good, that wants to love us, and that does love us. So if we could let go of that kind of guard, perhaps something new could come in. I recently heard on a podcast that we speak of the alpha male, And it's that alpha male. Usually it's, they're studying wolves. The problem is when they did that study, those wolves were in captivity. They were not acting normal. Those alpha wolves were being aggressive. They were dominating. They were forcing their will upon the pack. In nature, the alpha male is very, very different. In nature, our natural way of being alpha is more of an ally. Think of it more as that being that uses its power and strength in order to safeguard the community as a whole, but not in an aggressive way. Not in a, if you don't behave, it's not a wait till your father gets home type of energy, assuming that the father's going to be the one who gets physical and violent. I found a great example of this in Juneteenth, actually. So for those of our brothers and sisters in the Christ consciousness who celebrate Juneteenth, I'm always up for another holiday, so let's do this one too. Why not? Juneteenth is the day that is celebrated as the day that a certain gentleman by the name of Major General Gordon Granger put in at Galveston in Texas. It was 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the war, and 2 years later they finally got to Texas to say, by the way. Now the Emancipation Proclamation, it only freed slaves on the other side of the battle lines. So those people who had been held as slaves still needed to escape and get to safety. When the good Major General and his army showed up in Galveston, I'm willing to bet that they had to hang around and make sure that the law was enforced. And the people who had experienced slavery in Texas still had to learn how to live as free people, because the world around them was not going to change as quickly as just, all of a sudden, oh, okay, we're all free. If it was that easy, guys, we'd all be free of our belief in separation from good. If it was that easy, chocolate would be a diet food just because I proclaim it. Juneteenth is, for me, a celebration of enough of a shift in the idea of masculinity and masculine power, such that it enabled people who had been experiencing slavery, people of color, to have the breathing room to claim their freedom and then enforce it and see it brought about in the world. So it's more of a super ally. It saddens me, but I don't know that I know how to be a good ally like that yet. I'm working on it, but there it is. It's still part of the old culture that we know Major General Gordon Granger's name, but not the names of all of the people of color who chose to become free, who chose and moved into the world as free people. In the story of Exodus, Moses leads his people across the desert, but he's not able to go into the promised land. He still has the old consciousness of being a slave. And it takes them 40 years going through the desert to let go of slave-mindedness. It takes an entire generation. And we read the Bible as a great metaphor. So it takes us all a bit of time not to accept that declaration of freedom that came from our great ally, that came from the wisest part of us, to actually have it move into our behavior and our thought and our action and our words. So that is spirit guarding. It is the true alpha male. It is someone standing up and being on the right side of history. There is also, the important part of guarding and guiding is not smothering. So the guiding part has to be guiding, not doing for. The divine masculine that guides us is, in my life, the way I remember that in my life was many, many teachers teaching me how to see the world differently, apply my critical thinking skills, none of which would be possible if I couldn't read. And I don't know exactly who taught me to read or when it happened, but what I remember is laying on the floor with my dad with a book about Donald Duck. And Dad did the voices better than me, so I wanted him to read it, and it was easier if he read it, but he wouldn't do that. And as bad as I got at him, I was a good little girl, so I couldn't show it. I found myself reading. That's when I remember discovering that I could do it for myself. This is the kind of parent the divine masculine would be if they were the person that is helping someone who just got the training wheels off their bike, and that divine masculine is running behind the bike, kind of holding it but taking the hand off a little bit more, and the child figuring out that they're doing it themselves, they're doing it for themselves. This is the type of divine masculine I would love to embody, to simply be there as the support until somebody figures out that they're doing it for themselves. It is that divine masculine that knows to lead through example, not through fear and coercion. In my studies this week, I learned about a Hasidic rabbi called Lev Soros, and he lived from 1730 to 1796, and he went to visit his own rabbi, because another part is being able to ask for help yourself, being able to continue being teachable, staying in the willingness to learn more. And I don't know that there's a parent out there that would disagree with me when I say most parents feel like they are learning on the job the whole time, at least the ones I've heard of. So the rabbi went to his own rabbi, and when he came back, people were asking him, what words of Torah did your rabbi share with you? What words of wisdom did you bring back with you? And Rabbi Soros said, I didn't go to hear words of Torah. I went to see how he ties his shoes. The divine is in us and through us in every little simple thing we do. It's part of our everyday life, and every action is the divine masculine working through each and every one of us. And so if we know that we're one with God, tying our shoes becomes a deep spiritual right. One of the great sages who would absolutely agree with me on that is Confucius. And I spent some time learning about him this week. Because, most of us at least know who Jesus was. One of the things that was in our talk about, suggestions for how to do this talk, one of the things that was written in that template was in John 14:12, Jesus tells the apostles and us, these things and greater shall you do. He doesn't say these things and greater shall you pray for. So Jesus obviously got that he was calling us to pray and act, that we are to act from the beliefs, that there has to be a movement that happens in the world. The Buddha taught enlightenment after he did the work and attained it himself. He taught it to us as the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Paths and all sorts of beautiful, deep psychological wisdom. But he had us doing things. He called us to become enlightened for ourselves. Confucius is lesser known, at least in my life. I certainly wasn't taught about Confucius I was in Catholic school, so that makes sense. Confucius lived about 500 BCE, and it is his philosophy, his teaching that really informed the way people in the area that then became China lived in the world. And what he was, he was raised as kind of a poor kid. His jobs were what he considered menial, but he was of a class called sheep. And so he was what would be called like a gentleman scholar. And so he had the opportunity, he had the privilege of studying throughout his life, studying how to be of use, which was one of his big things. He wanted to go out there and be of use to the greater whole. In his philosophy, it was all about how do we take care of everybody and make sure that everybody is taken care of well. And the way he did it, and in his philosophy, that was by being part of a benevolent, wise government. In his mind, the best possible government worker was actually a sage, was someone who was righteous, was someone who had studied and understood how to live in the world as a full human. So Confucius actually started teaching when he was about 30. And in his world, the highest attainment he could have was actually to be an advisor to a king or their equivalent of a duke. At one point, he was teaching and studying and teaching and studying. And even though the classes were very carefully divided during his time, he was taking on students, legend has it, even some criminals, people from all different classes. So in his wisdom, what he said was that all of us have this inherent ability within us to become fully human, to become truly perfect as part of the greater whole. He did not reach the pinnacle of his own career until he was 50, and actually what he became was the Minister of Crime, which is basically like the chief of police. He took that on, and understanding that he had reached the pinnacle of his career, and from the way it's told, when he became the chief of police, all of a sudden there is this wave of morality that swept the land, that swept that province, as if just because he stood up and was the example and was the shining light, everybody else just kind of started behaving better. Now, when we are out there being true alphas, being truly the divine beings that we are, we can inspire people around us to be better, to be happier, to be more true to themselves and the God within them, to be more likely to listen to the God within them. Now, I don't know whether that actually happened. We don't have crime statistics from back then. We don't have, we don't have a lot of the story of Confucius's life. We do have some of the stories about him that kind of give an idea of who he was. So he had attained the pinnacle of his career, and legend had it that he really deeply disagreed with something that the government was doing. And so he stepped away from that job and became a traveling teacher. He would take in anyone. He would teach anyone so long as they were, in the way he thought of it, as zealous a student as he was. Now, when I say student, I don't just mean how to do politics. I mean a student of ritual, because in his world, and he was actually a ritual master, it was really important that you know how to do ritual correctly, that you know how to venerate the ancestors, that you know how to behave properly around your fellow man. And so when it said that when he walked into the palace as, even as the minister, when he was at the peak of his career, it was almost like he shrunk. And when he walked past anyone who outranked him, he would walk faster, which was a sign of respect in those days. He refused to think of himself as a sage. He didn't think of himself as a sage, although his followers called him that. He absolutely thought of himself as somebody who was trying to learn. And he was very open about the things that he felt that he had failed at. His inability to to embody truth when he hears it, his inability to let go of his opinions when he hears something that might be more true. In his world, that way of being in the world really took a lot of work, because for him, a scholar and a sage was basically what we would call a truly Christed being, which means that in his mind, the general idea was not to worry about what's going on up in heaven. He didn't talk about that much. He talked about, how are you behaving to your fellow man? How are you behaving? And yes, in his world, it was a very patriarchal society, and so it was all about, how do you teach the men around you? How do you lift up the men who outrank you or might need some support? It said that a student came to him and said, how do I serve the gods? How do I make the gods happy? And his response was, make the gods happy? Serve the gods? You don't even know how to serve your brother. You need to do that part first. That's teaching that is very prevalent in Islam. It's a teaching that's prevalent in Christianity. It's a teaching that's prevalent in actually all of the Abrahamic faiths. And so now we're finding it in what we would call the East as well as the West. Excuse me. Better. So he always was studying what it meant to be a true gentleman. That energy of humanity, of compassion, was something that they called run, or it's spelled kind of like Ren, R-E-N, but it's pronounced kind of somewhere between R-E-N and R-U-N. So I'm just going to say run. The symbol for that is the symbol of kind of a person with the number 2 in front of it. And so what it means is to be fully human in relationship to another full human, to any human actually. And so it gets translated as compassion or benevolence, or even better as humaneness. So given that we have that wonderful example, we have many wonderful examples here. What I want to point out to you is that within our teaching is something that we would call a mental equivalence. Confucius is the mental equivalent of a sage for us, or can be. Is the mental equivalent of someone who found his power in service. Now, yes, he absolutely felt strongly about how to do things. Don't think that he was just wishy-washy. He actually, while he was the minister of crime, he had people put to death. He had a group of dancers who he believed were lewd and just, getting all out of control. He had them put to death. And there was another teacher in the realm that he thought was a fake, that he saw as hypocritical. He had that guy put to death too. So he had the ability to be discerning according to the ways of his time and place, and act in a way that he might have found distasteful, might not have, I don't know, that we would find it distasteful. But there's one mental equivalent of a sage. Other mental equivalents might be the men who were in your life as you were being raised. Other mental equivalents might be a great leader from the past, whether it's somebody like Abraham Lincoln or somebody like Pope Francis, somebody like, I don't know, Martin Luther King. There are many that are out there that we can sit there and, this is where the religious science part comes in. We can say, okay, this is the mental equivalent of the divine masculine I've had. Looks a lot like Rambo. Is someone I'm scared of, or is so afraid of his own power that never stands up for himself. We can take that and say, I'm going to build a new idea. I'm going to get a new thought about the divine masculine and about my divine father that wants to express through me, that is healthier, that lets go of all of that toxic masculinity that hurts both men and women. And in letting go of the old idea, part of what we need to do is look at our behavior, because our behavior tells us what we truly believe. And it is very much part of the divine masculine to act. Ernest Holmes was really clear that this is a teaching that's really easy to teach but hard to follow. It's something that we run the risk of too much theory and too little practice. The Reverend Dr. Michael Bernard Beckwith wrote, when you truly have an insight or spiritual awakening, the next step is always action. And Ernest Holmes wrote, work without vision is drudgery, but vision without work is self-deception. You got that? Vision without work is self-deception. The well-balanced person can walk with his head in the clouds and still keep his feet solidly planted on the ground. Faith and work are ineffective when separated. And so the divine masculine within us wants to take all of these beliefs that we have and go out into the world. We treat and move our feet. We go to prayer and then let it carry us into our new behaviors based on the new thought that we have had. And so even if you had the best dad in the world, you can take that and say, thanks, Dad. I'm going to tweak that a little bit more so that the dad that lives in my head, the dad that I have embraced and is now indwelling me, the one that I'm taking on, is not only a great dad in all the ways my physical dad was, but is, I could actually really use an internal dad that's computer literate, as we have learned today. So we're going to claim that dad now. We're going to claim that divine dad that goes beyond all of our human experiences and build it now and let it carry us into our week. And we do that by going to prayer. And so in this moment, I invite you to close your eyes if you want to. Go within however that works for you. And by whatever name you call God, become aware now with me that there is only one life, one power, and one presence. There is no second presence and nothing out there to be afraid of. And so we rest comfortably within this oneness. I stand fully empowered within this oneness because that divine power lives within me, because there's nowhere else to be and nothing else to be. And I celebrate that the divine masculine and the divine feminine are fully existent in every being. And I call forth now a beautiful balance of both of those. A new idea about what the divine masculine is, so that when we are in activity, that is what is guarding and guiding us. I celebrate that this is simply something that already is. And so I stand witness to these God beings populating the planet right now in many, many, many different forms, many different colors, many different creeds, many different types of expression. It's all the divine being, and the divine being is perfect power, used perfectly. It is divine right action. It is right thinking and right knowing. It is expressed in this world as love and power and peace and joy and abundance. It is the divine harmony that allows us to move about the world, becoming better allies to each other and setting all of ourselves free from the mental slavery of old ideas. I bless and celebrate that this is just the truth of what already is. I have made nothing new. I simply stand in acknowledgement, and as I speak this word, I know that the power of spirit goes forth according to the law of cause and effect, with my most gracious gratitude to pull it into form. And so with a grateful heart, I just step back from it. I know it's already done. And so I let it be, and so it is.